love affair with trees. When I was a young girl, I would walk to the store for my mother, and I fell in love with this one particular tree. It was a hackberry tree, but it was a beautiful tree. And so I took a little branch and I made a wedding ring out of it, and I married that tree. And then when I got to be about 20, they had to cut the tree down. And would you believe I mourned over the tree after all those years? So I really am very concerned about Austin's beautiful, beautiful trees that are suffering because of the drought. I couldn't help but pull this off the internet this morning to start this with Trees by Joyce Kilmer. I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the sweet earth's flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made for fools like me, but only God can make a tree. So we're here today to hear Jerry Naiser, who is a certified arborist and a master gardener. I understand he's originally from around Houston. His people immigrated to this country many years ago, like most of ours did. I believe either from the Czech area or from the German area. And he owned his own business for a while, but now he's associated with someone else. But he has won many awards, and he has been so kind and generous to come and speak with us today about what we need to do about the trees that we love so much here in Austin. Mr. Naiser, I present you.
Thank you.
You need this mic.
I do. I'm going to try and speak up. If y'all can't hear me, just point your ear and I'll see
Do
you.
you want the lights turned off?
No, I don't think we need to. I think this is pretty bright. Is this even working?
It is.
Okay, perfect. And also, if you have any questions, stop me along the way. There's no reason to wait to the end. Let's keep this as informal as we can. And I'm going to try and explain a little bit about tree biology, how the drought affects trees and plants in general, how plants store food, retrieve that food, use it later. What you should do during a drought, because I really don't think this is quite over yet. In general, you know, we called the drought a record back in the 50s, but they found recently that actually we have a 10-year drought for every 100 years. So that's, you know, and hopefully this 10-year drought is getting to an end, but it's not quite been 10 years. So here we go. With trees, there's a lot of different processes that go on inside of a tree. People talk about feeding the trees. You don't actually feed a tree. A tree makes its own food through a process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis and water in general work together. What water does when we irrigate a tree, it's simply a transportation device. It moves nutrients through the root system up to the foliage where it evaporates. Sugars and starches are made at that point, and then they're distributed through the tree. Like most things, you know, because using sunlight varies from day to day. Some days it produces more than it needs, some days less. But in general, it's storing food all the time, like a battery. Okay, and it's using this food later for times of stress, and that stress can come from a lot of different factors. Insects, disease, drought, things like that. The root system of a tree generally extends out 3 times the height of the tree. Okay, when I see people water a tree, they usually think, okay, they dribble a hose right next to the trunk of the tree. That's really the wrong way to do it, especially on a newly planted tree, because tree roots tend to grow towards the higher level of moisture. The other thing that you'll commonly hear is, well, a tree broke my sewer line, or a tree broke my pool and the roots got into my pool. Actually, that's not true. Generally, the leak happened first, and then the tree roots grew to that higher level of moisture. That's just how that works. The best place to irrigate a tree is in the critical root zone, or even better yet, between the edge of the drip line and about 10% out from the trunk. That's where the highest absorption levels are for those roots. So if you know that, you can provide irrigation that's going to be used in a better way, and it's not going to be defeated by gravitational pull. And what I mean by that is that as soon as you put water on a lawn, or as soon as it rains on a lawn or whatever, gravity is going to start pulling that water down through the soil profile. The grass or your shrubs are going to get it first, the tree's going to get it last. So it takes a greater volume of water to penetrate down through and get to the root system. And the trick is allowing that tree to take most advantage from that water before it passes it on and gets into the aquifer or wherever it's going. There's a lot of different passages in a tree as far as it's almost like a highway system in that the water's coming upwards through a process called transpiration. That's that evaporation of the moisture from the foliage. Most of that happens in the morning hours. Okay, as the day goes on, it actually shuts that process down to a point. So the most effective time to water any plant is generally between the hours of 5:30 in the morning and about 10 o'clock. Beyond that time period, you're going to lose more water to evaporation and runoff than anything. So it's, that's another important thing to know. If you water at night, and a lot of people do try to do that to circumvent ordinances or whatever, a couple of things happen. We've talked about transpiration, right? When the sun's not out, the tree doesn't move as much water volume through the tree because it relies on the sunlight to actually pull that water upward and outward. So, the trick is to start watering and get enough water down right before the sun comes out. And that's why I say 5:30 in the morning. And that's true for lawns and landscapes as well. You want to start right then. Trees grow differently than what you probably think you know. Early in the year, what they do is they form branch wood. Okay? Later in the year, they form trunk wood. And so it's kind of a layering process that goes back and forth. That's what gives branches their structure, gives them their strength. And then it's the tissue is layered one on top of the other. If you have a tree and the tree doesn't know which is a branch, in other words, you've got two trunks on the tree that are similar in diameter, the tree's going to treat both of them as a branch, and they're going to develop wood at the same time. And they develop what's called included bark, or it's also called a codominant stem. These types of trees, because there's no layer into it, they're prone to storm damage, where one side will peel off or whatever. An example of that would be Bradford pears. They're really bad about that, or cottonwoods, or a lot of the softer tissue trees, where that point of attachment is too narrow. This is a drought-stressed tree. Pardon me. A drought-stressed tree, these are live oaks. And understand the drought affects a tree for many years after the drought. And that goes back to the food storage. So trees are always creating sugars and starches, storing the excess sugar and starches closely to where they're produced, but also in the root zone as well. The majority is actually stored in the root zone. So during a drought year, because the water's not available, the trees are going to start shutting down processes. One of the first processes that they shut down is actual asexual and sexual reproduction, which what that translates into what that means is fruit, nuts, and flowers. Those types of things. Those are all from sexual reproduction. The second thing they shut down is cellular reproduction. So trees expand every year in an outward manner. In other words, new cells develop on top of the old cells outwardly. And those inner older cells die back. That's where tree rings come from. I said earlier that they've figured out that the drought of record isn't really the drought of record. They figured that out through tree rings, because the wetter the year is, the wider the tree rings will be. Okay, the drier the year, the narrower they are. So they can actually look back in time by looking at the tree rings and see what the actual rainfall was for a particular year even, just by counting backwards. And by doing that, they figured out the cycle of the droughts, if you will. Everybody here knows, I hope, that weather runs in cycles. If you watch the news too much, you probably don't realize. Last night we had a really big rain, and my wife's like, "Turn the weather on." I'm like, "Why? Look out the window." It's raining really hard. What else do you need to know besides that? But all of our calendars were developed. I think there were three major ones, different parts of the earth at relatively the same time period, but they were all based on agriculture, and which goes back to moon cycles and things like that. But what the interesting part is, there's like an 80% chance that whatever the weather is today, it'll happen on pretty much on the same day next week. So if we have rain on a Thursday or on a Friday, then the following week of the same month, we're generally going to have that as well. And then if you look back at the previous year, same thing. If you look back in time as far as droughts go and excess rain, an interesting thing to watch is when is Lake Travis closed. Okay, and if you look back in time, almost to the button, it's every 10 years. And it's just those cycles, because one thing affects another. You hear about El Nino and La Nina and all that. Well, it really is a complete circle. And that's what causes those cycles. In different parts and different geographical areas, that cycle, runs on different days, but you can almost always count on it raining on Memorial Day, right? Generally around 1 o'clock. Anyway, if the weather guys told you that, then you probably wouldn't want to watch the weather. And we all know that the revenue on TV stations comes from people tuning in to watch the weather. So they tend to create hysteria, is what they do. So, after when you're in a drought, when the tree starts shutting down different processes, they tend to also shut down the parts of the tree or the plant that are the least productive. So what you'll see is the interior leaves and the lower foliage die back first. Okay? And one of the things that I always see the most is that most plant problems, regardless of what they are, they're from either overwatering or underwatering. A lot of people can't tell the difference because they kind of look similar to a point, but not really if you know what to look for. It also seems like the first thing anybody does when there is a plant problem is to throw more water on it, thinking that that's going to fix it. Generally doesn't. So we talked about water. One of the things I saw last year, and I really thought it was kind of interesting, one of the news stations, I don't remember which one it was, they were reporting on a guy, and they were under the water restrictions, and you're not supposed to water your grass. And the guy said, "I'm not watering my grass, I'm watering my trees." And I thought, well, that's pretty clever, because there's not an ordinance written that says you can't water your trees. In fact, they're all specifically excluded. And I thought, well, okay, that's one way to get around it. Again, you want to water in the morning when the water can be used the most. You want to, there's a lot of different ways to do it. If you're going to do it with a hose, which is probably the most common way, you want to just dribble the hose and you want to move it around. Think about 10, 2, and 4 on a clock, because again, you want the roots to develop evenly around the tree. And if you're always watering to one side, you're going to develop a weak root structure. So you want to rotate that around. And the best way to do that is, of course, with a soaker hose. Second best way is with, a portable sprinkler, which I know that you can get away with. Nobody's going to, but that's obviously you're watering your trees, right? And, if you turned on your irrigation system, you might have a little trouble with that. I have been going to all the water meetings for the city of Austin, and I'm pretty familiar with what they're doing and the direction that they're going. And the direction is, even in years that aren't drought, we're going to pretty much stay in stage 1 restrictions year round, and they're going to limit watering to twice a week. That's just what they're going to do. So, last year, I don't know if anybody's done any economic studies on the loss of real property because of lack of irrigation, but it's huge. Landscapes provide value to their home. They cost money to install, and they cost money every day to maintain through irrigation. And to not be able to provide that irrigation, you're going to lose it. That's just as simple as that. The city of Austin knew what our growth was going to be for the last several decades, but they didn't put money into infrastructure. At the time, the city council that we had back in the 90s, really, in the mid to late 90s, they tried to control growth by limiting infrastructure. And that didn't really quite work. People are going to come anyway. So now I'm kind of paying the price on that. And that's fine. An easy way to check how dry your soil is whether or not you need to irrigate it is just trying to punch a screwdriver into the ground. With our heavy clay soil, you're going to have to stand up on top of it if it's dry. The wetter it is, the easier it'll slide into the ground. To that point, we have a door prize tonight. If you haven't signed in, on my sheet, if you would, please do that. There's what we're giving away is a combination pH meter, water meter, light meter. And you can use it outside or inside or wherever you want, but it's a great tool just to see if the plant needs water. And again, any plant. This time of year when the temperatures tend to run in the 80s, a lot of people tend to actually overwater their plants. It's one of the biggest problems because people want to irrigate on a cycle instead of whether or not the plant needs it. When we get up into the 90s and 100s, you can assume it needs it, but now not so much. If you wanted to measure the output of your irrigation device, whatever it is, whether you're irrigating through a hose or a sprinkler system, it's really easy to do and it's important to do as well. In the summertime, we know that what plants need based on temperature and rainfall. And with irrigation, what you're really doing is you're subsidizing rainfall. So if you don't get enough rain during the week, you want to add that much in inches by an irrigation device. And the way that you check what your sprinkler system is putting out, and it doesn't matter how you're putting that water out, the easiest way to do that is to put a catch can out. You can't really use a rain gauge because rain tends to fall more vertically and sprinklers sort of sideways. So you need to have a wider catch can, and a tuna can works, a cat food can, that type of thing. But run your sprinkler for say 15 minutes, and then just stick a ruler in it, and you'll know how much it's putting out. A typical tree uses, a mature tree uses about 2 to 3 gallons per diameter inch of trunk per day. Okay, so they actually use a lot of water. 2 gallons per diameter inch of tree trunk. A lawn, when temperatures are up in the low 90s, a lawn will use about 1.25 inches a week. When you get over 100, it's going to use about 1.75 inches per week. That's in full sun. And it really doesn't matter what kind of lawn it is. You'll hear people say that certain types of lawn, like a zoysia lawn, will use less, or a Bermuda lawn will use less. Not really. It's not really measurable. Technically you can say that, but that was more of a sales tool from the person that sold it, and people tend to repeat what they hear, but it's actually all about the same. The difference really comes into whether it's full shade or full sun. A full shade area will generally use about half as much water. If you were going to irrigate a tree, and you really wanted to, this is the way that you would do it if you were really concerned about a tree. That's a soaker hose wrapped around it many times. But most people aren't going to do that. Generally, just one lap around a tree with a soaker hose, inside the drip line by about 20%, say. That's really the best place to do it. It's just a single wrap. And you can put that hose on a timer, and you really don't have to mess with it. What we're seeing this year after the drought, when trees are trying to recover, what we're seeing is that they don't have the stored reserves. We talked about energy production, sugar starch production. They hold those stored sugars in their root zone throughout the tree like a battery waiting to release. They actually have to have water to do that as well. So they have to have water to produce that, and then they have to have water to use it. You hear about photosynthesis, but there's another side to that. It's called respiration. And respiration is actually the breaking of a chemical bond to release that energy. And most of that happens in the root zone. And it's the opposite, again, of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide and produces oxygen, where respiration takes in oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. So it's really kind of the opposite of that. During drought, you want to limit construction. And you want to limit especially high nitrogen fertilizers. And the reason is that anytime you make a cut on a tree, regardless of what it is, the tree wants to callus over that wound. It wants to heal that wound. And so it's going to take that stored energy and focus on trying to heal that area. High nitrogen fertilizers during a drought year want to cause sporadic leggy type growth through the tree. Okay, without the water available, it's going to fall on its face and you're going to end up with a damaged tree. You don't want to do any type of construction near the tree, especially root compaction. People think construction is cutting limbs, bringing it off a house. Root compaction as well, driving heavy equipment across the root zone or cutting the roots to lay a pipe, that kind of thing. Again, it all requires a tree to expend energy to try and heal those things, heal those problems. And the other thing is that if they don't have the energy to heal those problems, secondary problems set in. You know, it's like going to the hospital with a broken leg and getting the flu, and you know the flu takes you out. You know, when you're in a weakened state, secondary problems become major problems and sometimes fatal problems. Again, don't water next to the trunk of the tree. And, you know, especially new trees as well. We'll get into new trees in a minute, but try and keep it out if you can. The interesting thing about trees is that they found through research it's the opposite of lawns, in that trees like frequent irrigation, where lawns like heavy saturation irrigation. So studies have shown that frequent irrigation is much more beneficial to a tree than a heavy dose of water. The other issue is that when you flood like this, remember I said that it takes oxygen and respiration that goes on in the root zone. When you flood a tree like this and you saturate the soil, there's no oxygen present in the soil. And so that respiration can't occur, and you're not going to have those chemical bonds being broken. And at the end of the day, that just simply means the tree can't feed itself. And the problems are going to get worse. So do check the soil to see if the tree needs to be irrigated again. You can do that with a screwdriver. Very, very easy to do. Water inside that drip line, towards the edge of the drip line, that's the area that will absorb the most. And the other thing is realize a native live oak, the tree's roots are 3 times out. So anything your neighbor does is going to affect your trees and vice versa. And the root systems all graft together, so they work kind of in a symbiotic relationship. One will feed the other, it will help the other, but on the other side of that, if one tree gets a disease, like oak will, it's going to spread through those grafted roots as well. And a weakened tree is more susceptible to diseases. And a healthy tree, oak will sometimes bypass, because its own defense system can take care of it. So after a drought, same kind of thing. You want to limit pruning. You know, there's no reason to prune a tree that doesn't need to be pruned. When I say limit pruning, there's some things that you have to do to maintain your property, like keeping the roof cleared and that kind of thing. But in general, any wound, again, that you create, the tree's going to want to try and heal. And it's going to try and callus over that root. Go ahead.
Next door, they have 2, I think they call them catawba trees, that bloom the beautiful white blossoms. Mm-hmm. And one tree withstood the drought just fine, and it had beautiful blooms and it's full of leaves. The other one has got leaves only about the first 2 or 3 rows of branches, and then the tree is at least 75 to 100 feet tall. That's all dead. And he wanted that, and they were asking, be sure and ask you, should he top the tree out?
Generally not. Topping's not an acceptable practice, because when you top a tree, what happens is from every cut that you make, it's going to throw off 3 or 4 new shoots. It's called apical dominance. In other words, if you've ever trimmed a boxwood hedge before or anything like that, every time you make a cut, it throws out 3 or 4 new shoots. That's what you end up with. And at the beginning, we talked about codominant stems and included bark, and 2 branches have 2 types of form of attachment, and how the tissue layers on top. What you end up with is all those newly created branches that come out, all will have included bark. So every one of them will have a predisposition to fail.
Well, do you think that those branches that are still green are going to send nutrients up and revitalize the upper portion of that tree? Because at least, I would say, 2/3 of the tree looks dead.
He needs to wait a year and see what happens, because oftentimes trees will shut down parts of itself, right, to try and conserve energy, but it doesn't mean that it's dead. And complete trees will do that as well. So it's important to check the tree and make sure it's actually dead. You can do that by grabbing a twig and just breaking it. If it snaps real quick, it's dead. If it bends, it's not. So, check those areas that you think is dead and, bend them and see if they break, see if they snap. That's how you make that judgment call as to whether or not to go ahead and do something with it. There's a technique called drop cropping that you can get in touch with an arborist and they can do that. It's different from topping, and it'll help revitalize that tree and get it going again if that's what's necessary. What you don't want to do is use a fertilizer that's heavy on nitrogen or heavy on phosphorus. Okay, generally you want to, fertilizer are sold in ratios. That first number is nitrogen, the second one is phosphorus, the last one is potassium, right? And so phosphorus, the middle number, is what's responsible for the flowers, nuts, fruits, sexual reproduction, that kind of thing. You don't want that to happen, okay? What you want is the first number to equal the last number, the nitrogen and the potassium to be the same. And that'll help the tree recover. If the nitrogen is heavy on nitrogen, it'll produce all that leggy growth. The potassium, on the other hand, is responsible for a lot of the different health functions of the plant. Did you have a question?
Yes. Where is that available?
Well,
Yeah.
at Home Depot and Lowe's, any of the big box stores, they don't, if you look for the Joe Spikes or the Miracle Grow products, you'll find that. The better place to go, that you'll find a better selection, and they will sell to the public even though it's state wholesale only, is John Deere Landscapes.
Well, most of the places you can't find that 10-10. I'm looking for it.
If you look at, there's a company called Doggett, and they sell specifically tree fertilizers, and they can be bought online. And there's a company called Rittenhouse. It's rittenhouse.ca because they're a Canadian company, and they'll ship and sell to anybody, and they sell a really good variety of fertilizers.